Hello everybody and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips, and today we're going to talk about behaviors related to diet and lifestyle change. I have two areas that I want to cover, and the first one has to do with fast and comprehensive change versus what we call the baby steps approach. I've always been an advocate of making sweeping changes to diet and lifestyle rather than a lengthy phasing in process where we drink more water this week and we do something else next week, and sometimes called the baby steps approach. And the argument, by the way, for making a few changes at a time are that you don't overwhelm the person so much and they master a couple of skills before moving on. My objection to it and the downside of this, in my opinion, is that a lot of the bad food stays in the house, tempting people to eat it. Incremental change can be hard to measure when you're talking about, eat less, do more. I don't know what less and more means, and I think probably all of us, including the several thousand of you that listen to this every week, we would have a different definition of less and more if we were asked. The other problem, and this is a major one, is that in the beginning when you're making these baby steps changes, they often don't add up to enough to make any change in weight or health status, and it's really easy for people to lose their motivation. People can be much more motivated if they are shown how to make a change that changes their life in some significant way. Now, one thing I'll mention is most health improvement and weight loss programs fail for most people. So our thinking around here is if a strategy is widely used by others, then we want to exclude it from our repertoire. So since so many health coaches and programs use the baby steps approach, for us that's a good enough reason to avoid it. There's some evidence to suggest that our one big change, sweeping change thing is a good idea. A couple of examples would be alcoholics. They're not told to gradually withdraw from alcohol. Drug addicts don't gradually withdraw from drugs in most cases. They're just taught to quit. You just got to stop doing this. And while smokers are often counseled to gradually withdraw from cigarette smoking, a new study shows that's not such a good idea. One big change and just quitting already is a better approach. Now, the study that I'll be talking about involved 697 smokers, 355 of which were assigned to an abrupt cessation group, and 342 who were assigned to engage in gradual cessation. Participants in the abrupt cessation group each chose a date 2 weeks in advance on which day they were just going to quit smoking. The gradual cessation folks reduced their smoking by 50% the first week, by 25% at the end of week 2, and then they stopped smoking entirely. Participants in both groups got some behavioral support from nurses. They both were given nicotine replacement patches before and after quitting. Those who participated in the abrupt cessation group were taught to anticipate times and situations in which they would be tempted to smoke, and then they were able to develop strategies to avoid relapse. That's a cognitive approach that's very effective for discontinuing any kind of habit that you're trying to change. Well, here's what happened. At week 4, 39.2% of the gradual cessation smokers were still abstinent, while 49% of the abrupt cessation smokers were still abstinent. Now, the gap narrowed a little bit at 6 months, which is not surprising. It's hard to quit smoking. This may shock you, but I used to be a smoker, and I smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day under the philosophy that, more is always better. I've never been a halfway kind of girl. Moderation doesn't work for me. But in any case, it is difficult. But at 6 months, the abrupt cessation participants were still ahead, with 22% of them being abstinent as opposed to 15.5% of the slowly gradual cessation group. The patient's preference for quitting seemed to matter. When asked, those who preferred quitting gradually were significantly less likely to be abstinent than those who said, I want to just do it already, I just want to quit. And that didn't matter, it didn't end up mattering which group they were assigned to. The ones who said, I just want this over with, ended up much better. The researchers didn't really comment on this, but my idea is that people who are motivated to make changes are usually more willing to commit to being all in than those who want things to be different but not yet fully committed to working toward their goal. The authors concluded, quote, we found clear evidence that quitting abruptly was superior in the short and longer term. Participants who preferred to quit gradually were less likely to achieve abstinence regardless of how they were allocated to quit. So I guess what this tells me is we're going to continue to do what we've always done here, which is to basically tell people, you need to make some abrupt changes. Clean out the pantry, stop using oil, get rid of the dairy. Don't keep chocolate in the house, tempting yourself to eat it, and just get this over with and get on to the path to a new life. Now, I'm going to transition to another habit-related article I'm going to talk about here shortly, but I do want to say that I think part of the reason why we've been successful at doing this is we've asked people to make reasonable changes, and so we don't do this 21 days of perfection followed by nobody can sustain this or even wants to. We don't make people give us silly commitments like I'm never going to have another cookie or a piece of chocolate. I don't want to make that commitment. I got to quit if we're going to make silly promises like that. So I think that if the recommendations and the things that you're asking people to do are reasonable, you can get them to do what they need to do in order to change their health in many, if not most instances, and just get this over with already. All right, now let's talk about motivation for behavior. And believe it or not, this has to do with genetic testing, and which I'm talking a lot about because there sure is a lot of enthusiasm for it, in spite of the fact that there have been almost no advances made in the prevention or treatment of disease based on the discovery of genetic mutations and predispositions. Proponents of genetic testing have stated that one of the potential benefits of knowing one's genetic profile is that knowing it might motivate somebody to change their behavior. So a person who knows that he's at high risk of developing coronary artery disease might eat less meat and dairy, and a smoker might quit if he finds out that he's at higher risk or she's at higher risk of developing cancer. Now, other people on the other side of the issue have said, well, maybe it would be counterproductive and actually demotivate people, because if people say, well, my genes are terrible, I'm probably going to get sick anyway, so I might as well just eat, drink, and be merry since I'm destined to get sick. Well, to answer the question, which is it, or maybe neither of the above, researchers analyzed 18 studies that looked at the relationship between knowing one's genetic risk and whether or not it influenced change in their behavior. Now, the types of things that they looked at were smoking cessation and the genetic risks for lung and esophageal cancer and Crohn's disease. Some studies looked at alcohol use and genetic risks for cancer. Some looked at melanoma risk and skin protection. 7 looked at dietary behaviors and the risk for conditions like type 2 diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. And 6 looked at physical activity and its relationship to all of those diseases. In other words, if I'm at high risk for diabetes, am I more inclined to engage in physical activity? 2 looked at participation in screening programs and support groups. Well, the researchers reported that learning about genetically based risks for disease has little to no effect on health-related behaviors. This doesn't motivate people. The absence of effect was strongest for smoking cessation and physical activity, and similar for screening and behavioral support groups. Genetic risk communication results in a tiny, barely perceptible difference in dietary behavior, and they wrote, quote, expectations that communicating DNA-based risk estimates changes behavior are not supported by the existing evidence. So one more reason to term all this genetic testing as being basically useless. A similar Cochrane review published in 2010 reached the same conclusion. The researchers found little to no effect of genetic testing on changing behaviors like smoking, diet, physical activity, and alcohol use. So if this doesn't help, what might help? What would motivate people to change their habits? Well, some studies have shown that people make changes when they think that both the change will benefit them and that the changes that they are contemplating are achievable. Studies also show that people are more motivated to make changes when the motivation comes from within rather than being informed about why and what to do by others. Now, there are 2 important points I want to make here, and the first one is that the diet and lifestyle changes that you recommend to people need to result in change. In other words, going back to what I was talking about previously, a lot of times this baby steps approach just doesn't really do much good for people. But as I've advised for years, they cannot be so restrictive and difficult that most people can't really visualize themselves doing it. It's a barrier to getting started. Another thing is that healthcare professionals, and I can be guilty of this too, we tend to be really good at telling clients and patients about health-related issues and diet and lifestyle change, but not so good at collaborating with them to identify barriers and obstacles and plan around them. So we're good at informing and informing is not an intervention. So really working with people to identify their barriers and how to overcome them is very important. In terms of the type of information that does make somebody want to change, research shows that positive rather than negative messages work better. Health professionals tend to deliver negative messages, and in fact, the genetic predisposition issue can be perceived as a negative message. In other words, you have an increased risk for both cancer and heart disease, so if you don't quit smoking, you're going to die early. I think we can all agree that's a pretty negative message. According to Cornell researcher Brian Wansink, health messages are framed as either gain-framed or loss-framed. Gain-framed messages emphasize the benefits that you're going to get by making changes. Loss-framed messages are more directed at the consequences you will suffer if you don't do whatever it is that the health message is trying to get you to do. In most instances, people are going to respond better when they're told how things will get better rather than the terrible things that might happen to them in the future. This is particularly true if the future bad event is far off and not guaranteed. And here's what that really means. If somebody says to me, Pam, you have a high risk of developing diabetes, so you better start exercising and eating well. Well, I might develop diabetes at some time in the future. It's not immediate. I'll tell you what is immediate is the pleasure that I can get from eating chocolate and sitting on the couch instead of stir fry and exercise. And so that's when the threatening messages have the least impact, is when the terrible event that's going to happen is way far off in the future. So here's the bottom line. I think we have to start looking for better ways of communicating our message. I mean, most adults in this country are overweight and sick, or on their way to becoming that way. And the reason we have to pay attention to it is if our current methods of communication and our current interventions were working, we wouldn't see the problem continue to get worse as it is. We'd see it continue to get better. So I think that we have a great message about all the wonderful things that can happen when people take control of their health and become real proactive on their own behalf. We've just got to get better at talking about that instead of just trying to scare people all the time, which, as it turns out, doesn't really have much of an impact. All right, that's all for today, and actually all for the week. So as usual, please pass this on to anybody who you think would enjoy watching it, and I'll be back to you next week with more news.